The Pacific wind carried a taste of salt and ash. It pressed against the gray waves where ships approached the battered coastline of Japan, their metal hulls streaked with rust and memory. The war was not yet over, but it was breaking, like an exhausted tide collapsing upon itself. Men in khaki stood along the railings of transports, their eyes fixed on the shoreline, where distant roofs smoked like extinguished candles. They had been told that peace was near, but no one believed in peace anymore, only pauses between orders. The Americans had been on islands before, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each a name that clung to the inside of their helmets like a ghost. They had landed with rifles and rations, burned fields, built airstrips, counted the dead, but Japan itself was different. It was not an island for conquest anymore. It was a defeated country, silent under the burden of its own surrender. The air smelled faintly of soot and something else, unfamiliar, fragile, almost sweet. They stepped ashore in the ruins of a fishing town near Yokosuka. The harbor was filled with broken boats, their masts bent like ribs. Children watched from the alleys, barefoot and wary. The soldiers did not speak to them. They walked past with that careful restraint of conquerors, uncertain of their victory. The locals bowed slightly, mechanically, as though responding to invisible commands. Above the wreckage, laundry fluttered from half-collapsed balconies, an unbroken rhythm of life clinging to dust. The military orders were clear: secure the area, establish posts, maintain discipline. Yet discipline thinned in the quiet. Combat readiness gave way to an awkward stillness, men accustomed to shouting now, whispering to one another, their voices softened by the hush of a defeated nation. The army kitchens began distributing their standard fare: canned beans, powdered eggs, bread bleached of flavor. The soldiers ate by the water, watching fishermen mend torn nets with hands too thin for the task. The smell of something cooking reached them, faint, rising from a corner street where smoke coiled gently above a rusted drum. It was the scent that first broke their discipline. They followed it almost unconsciously, drawn by hunger that was not of the body but of memory, of warmth, of something alive. The street was narrow, the buildings leaning inward as if whispering secrets. There, among the remnants of market stalls, a woman in a faded kimono stood before a makeshift stove. Her face was expressionless, her eyes lowered. Beside her, a boy turned skewers over a bed of glowing charcoal. Small, round pieces of something sizzled on the grill, releasing a sweet, savory aroma that cut through the metallic tang of the harbor. The Americans stopped at a distance. They were not sure if they were allowed to be curious. The woman looked up briefly, not in defiance, but acknowledgment. The boy continued turning the skewers, fanning the coals. A few coins exchanged between soldiers, a hesitation. Then one of them stepped forward, awkwardly, holding out a ration biscuit as if it were a passport. The woman did not take it. She simply nodded, and the boy offered a skewer. No words passed. The soldier tasted. It was soft, smoky, glazed with something faintly sweet. The meat, chicken perhaps, though it was hard to tell, carried the flavor of fire and sugar, a strange echo of something homely. He chewed slowly, the taste mingling with the sound of wind and waves, with memories of rations and death. Around him, others began to accept the same skewers, exchanging cigarettes, coins, or just gestures of thanks. The scene unfolded quietly, without ceremony, a small communion amid ruin. That evening, as the soldiers returned to camp, the scent of grilled food lingered on their uniforms. In the mess tent, they did not speak of it, but something subtle had changed. The war had turned them into machines of endurance, but for a moment they had remembered hunger as something human, not strategic. In the days that followed, patrols continued through the shattered towns. The Americans documented bomb damage, confiscated weapons, catalogued silence. They found entire neighborhoods flattened, temples burned, gardens reduced to gray ash. Yet in every corner there was food, improvised, humble, persistent. Street vendors appeared like ghosts, their carts rebuilt from scrap wood, their offerings meager but real. Rice balls wrapped in newspaper, bowls of watery noodles, roasted chestnuts, pickled vegetables in cracked jars. The soldiers watched, at first from a distance, then closer, until observation became participation. The taste of Japan, smoky, salty, fermented, seeped into their routines. A sergeant who had lost 2 fingers in Okinawa began trading American coffee for miso soup. A medic collected ceramic bowls from abandoned houses, polishing them as though restoring fragments of a lost civilization. In the ruins of Yokohama, a small group of engineers sat one evening near a collapsed bridge, sharing yakitori with 2 local fishermen. No one spoke. The language was smoke, gesture, and the slow rhythm of eating. The army photographers, sent to capture the reconstruction, began turning their lenses not toward ruins, but toward food. Their reels filled with images of hands, American and Japanese, passing bowls, holding chopsticks, sharing fire. The official reports did not mention this. It was not policy. It was something quieter, something the war could not measure. And yet, even in this fragile exchange, the shadow of occupation lingered. The Americans carried their authority like a second uniform. The Japanese offered food not only from kindness, but from necessity, the barter of survival. Hunger leveled them, but did not erase the distance between victor and vanquished. Still, in those narrow alleys, beside broken shrines and rubble-strewn courtyards, they found a rhythm that belonged to neither army nor empire, the simple, persistent act of feeding and being fed. In the reports sent back to Washington, such encounters were footnotes at best. "Local cooperation observed," one officer wrote. But beneath those sterile words lay something ineffable, the first taste of understanding born not from treaties or commands, but from the smoke of a street vendor's grill. The American soldiers did not know the word umami, but they felt it, that depth, that unspeakable harmony between salt and sweetness, char and flesh. It was the flavor of endurance, of a people who had lost everything and still found a way to offer warmth through food. It unsettled them more than the ruins did. They had come expecting resistance, hatred, perhaps surrender. They had not expected kindness. And as the summer heat thickened and the occupation deepened, the memory of that first taste stayed, in letters home, in half-remembered dreams, in the way they began to look at the enemy as something fragile, human, capable of flavor. The war was ending, but something else had begun, an unspoken dialogue carried by the scent of food across the language of silence. Morning broke with a dull brightness, the kind that carried no promise. Japan's cities were beginning to wake from the anesthesia of war. Smoke still curled from the wreckage, but markets were stirring again, small, hesitant movements of life reassembling itself from dust. In the streets, wooden carts rolled over broken stones, their wheels squeaking like questions. The smell of the sea mixed with the faint sweet odor of soy and grilled fish. For the first time in years, it was the scent of food, not fire, that filled the air. The Americans had taken over a school building on the edge of town as their temporary headquarters. The blackboards still bore faint arithmetic from lessons never finished. Soldiers slept beneath maps, ate beside desks, scarred by time and chalk. They had grown used to the stillness of the occupation, the absence of gunfire, the muted rhythm of rebuilding. Yet beneath that quiet ran a current of uncertainty, a question too large to voice. What came after victory? Outside the compound, the locals moved like shadows, cautious, deferential, purposeful. Women carried baskets of vegetables from makeshift gardens, fishermen patched nets with borrowed twine, children scavenged metal and glass to sell to traders, and here and there street vendors appeared again, their small fires marking the city's slow return to life. Their food was simple, born of scarcity: grilled sardines, rice pressed into triangles, soups thin as memory. But it was sustenance, and its presence meant that time was moving forward. The soldiers watched, then drifted closer. Curiosity replaced suspicion. Hunger was the common tongue. They began to exchange goods: sugar for rice, tobacco for soy, coffee for miso. The language of barter carried its own grammar, built of nods and gestures. In the absence of words, taste became a bridge. One afternoon, near the ruins of a marketplace, a group of Marines stood watching an old man cooking beside a stone wall. His cart was little more than a crate balanced on two bicycle wheels, the fire contained in a rusted oil drum. The smell was intoxicating, something between caramel and charcoal, both foreign and familiar. He worked slowly, with the patience of one who had survived too much to hurry. Batter poured from a small ladle into round molds. Bits of octopus or fish were dropped inside. Each piece turned with precision, as if the act itself were a ritual of remembrance. Takoyaki, someone later learned the name was. The Americans waited until he gestured, offering small paper cups. The first bite burned the tongue: crisp shell, molten center, a sweetness that softened into smoke. They laughed, not out of joy, but disbelief. The world was still broken, yet here was flavor, here was care. The food was not meant for them. It was meant to remind the man himself that something human still existed in his hands. The encounter spread by rumor. Other patrols returned, speaking of noodles cooked over barrel fires, of rice cakes wrapped in seaweed, of women trading pickled plums for coffee tins. The food became a quiet obsession, not a luxury, but a proof of life. Each meal taken outside the barracks blurred the lines between occupier and occupied, though the lines themselves never vanished. The Americans still carried rifles. The Japanese still bowed. Yet between them, over bowls of steaming broth, there was a silence that no command could interpret, a shared recognition of hunger's democracy. The official photographers began to record these moments, not out of sentiment, but duty. The War Department wanted images of reconstruction, of civility, of the new Japan. But what the film captured was something deeper: the way the soldiers' faces softened as they ate, the way their eyes changed when they looked at the people who fed them. It was not reconciliation, it was something humbler, an acknowledgment of endurance. In the evenings, the streets glowed faintly from oil lamps. The soldiers wandered, drawn by scent and sound. They found ramen stalls rebuilt from bombed-out wood, their roofs patched with canvas. Inside, broth simmered in dented pots, rich with bones and salt. The cooks moved with quiet dignity, each gesture deliberate. The soldiers sat on overturned crates, their boots muddy, their helmets resting beside them. Steam rose, curling around their faces like forgiveness. They learned to use chopsticks clumsily, to bow slightly when served, to nod instead of speak. The ritual of eating, the patience, the precision, was foreign to them. Back home, meals were fast, loud, plentiful. Here, each bowl carried weight, each bite a history of scarcity. They began to understand that food was not only sustenance, but a kind of language, one that spoke of resilience and continuity. The taste of soy and fish, of rice and smoke, became a translation of survival. The local children followed them sometimes, curious. They laughed when the Americans spilled broth or dropped noodles. The soldiers responded with chocolate, gum, cigarettes, offerings of a different empire. The children learned to say thank you in halting English. But the real exchange was wordless. When one soldier broke a biscuit in half and dipped it into miso soup, the gesture said more than any interpreter could. Winter came early that year. Snow fell over the ruins, softening their edges. The markets shrank again, the fires burned lower. Yet even in the cold, the street vendors persisted. The soldiers found warmth in the same way the locals did, huddled near coals, hands extended toward steam. They learned to recognize the smell of chestnuts before they were roasted, to tell miso from soy by scent alone. Hunger turned into understanding. Understanding turned into reflection. One night, a small group of infantrymen stationed near Tokyo were invited, unofficially, to a meal prepared by a local family. The war's rules forbade such intimacy, but the lines between rule and need had blurred. The home was half collapsed, its roof patched with tar paper, its floor swept clean of glass. On the table stood a pot of rice and a single dish of pickled radish. The food was sparse, yet the family served it with a grace that felt ancient. The Americans sat awkwardly, unsure where to place their hands. They ate slowly, grateful yet burdened by the weight of the moment. Every bite tasted of contradiction, of guilt, of gratitude, of something beyond both. When they left, they tried to pay. The woman shook her head. Payment was unnecessary. The meal had not been a transaction, but a ceremony, a fragile reconciliation enacted through nourishment. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing footprints as quickly as they were made. In their letters home, the soldiers wrote of the food more than the destruction. They described rice that steamed like clouds, soup that smelled of sea and smoke, grilled fish eaten under broken lanterns. Their words surprised their families. How could these men, hardened by combat, write with such tenderness about taste? But war does not end where battles do. It lingers in the senses, in what is remembered and what is consumed. By spring, the first signs of renewal appeared. Fields were being replanted, markets reopened with new energy. The food, though still modest, carried an undercurrent of hope. The Americans noticed it, the way flavors deepened, the way meals grew slightly more generous. A sense of recovery, cautious yet real, entered the rhythm of the city. The soldiers had begun to fade into the background of this new life, their presence now routine. But among them, the memory of those first encounters, the skewers, the soup, the silence, had rooted itself deeply. It had changed the texture of victory, made it less triumphant, more reflective. They came to understand that taste could bear memory, that flavor could bridge what politics could not. The food of Japan, humble, improvised, alive, had offered them not forgiveness, but recognition, and recognition was enough. By the summer of 1946, Japan had begun to breathe again, shallowly but with intent. The air was cleaner, the fires fewer, the streets alive with movement that was neither military nor desperate. The cities were still wounded, their skeletons visible in every skyline, but new voices rose from the ruins. Merchants, teachers, children chasing stray dogs through alleys lined with tar paper walls. The occupation was no longer a shock, it had become a rhythm. American trucks rumbled through narrow streets, past women washing clothes in metal basins, past boys flying kites stitched from old maps of the empire. In the mornings, the soldiers still lined up for roll call, still maintained their routines, patrols, paperwork, drills, but the war had receded from their bodies. The adrenaline that had once defined their existence was gone, replaced by a dull vigilance. They were young men made old by silence. Some sought distraction in cards or liquor, others in correspondence courses or photography. Yet many, more than they would admit, found themselves drawn again to the small fires of the street vendors, to the smell of grilled fish and soy, to the fragile taste of a country learning to live with defeat. In those moments, something unspoken passed between them and the Japanese. It was not forgiveness nor friendship in the sentimental sense. It was coexistence, the quiet acknowledgment that survival required both sides to move forward, however uneasily. Food became the medium of that movement. One sergeant stationed near Osaka began writing notes about what he ate. He kept a small notebook, grease-stained, the pages curling, filled with sketches and descriptions. Fried sweet potato dusted with salt. Smells of the docks. Reminds me of Georgia. Another entry read, soup with seaweed, salt, broth, smoke, calm. These were not culinary observations, but fragments of introspection, as if he were documenting a language he did not yet speak. By the time his deployment ended, the notebook was full. He left it behind when he boarded the ship home. A Japanese boy later found it and used the pages to wrap rice balls for sale. History, like flavor, was always being consumed. The GI's presence shaped the food economy. American rations leaked into local kitchens, spam, flour, canned milk, chocolate, transforming the landscape of taste. Out of these collisions came new dishes, rice cooked with margarine, bread filled with bean paste, soups thickened with tinned meat. The Japanese called it yoshoku, Western-style food, adapted and reinvented. To the Americans, it was both strange and familiar, a reflection of themselves refracted through another culture's hunger. Food stalls near the bases began selling American sandwiches, thick, improvised creations of fried egg and pickled vegetables between slices of white bread. Soldiers lined up, half amused, half nostalgic. They tasted home, distorted but sincere. The vendors smiled shyly when the soldiers nodded approval. It was commerce, yes, but also exchange. Of identity, of curiosity, of endurance. War had flattened distinctions, food rebuilt them, bite by bite. The occupation authorities intent on reforming Japan saw such scenes as evidence of normalization. Reports spoke of positive interactions and cultural integration. Yet beneath those bureaucratic phrases lay something more delicate, a fragile empathy that no policy could script. For every photograph of a smiling soldier beside a noodle stall, there were unspoken histories. The father lost in the Pacific, the son buried on Okinawa, the mother who cooked simply to forget. Still, in the act of feeding, there was resistance against despair. Some soldiers began visiting the same vendors daily. Bonds formed not through words, but through routine. The repetition of a meal created a rhythm, and rhythm created trust. One corporal, once a machinist from Detroit, helped a noodle vendor repair his cart's broken axle. Another brought surplus flour for a woman making dumplings. Acts that would have been unthinkable a year earlier became unremarkable. The war's edges had softened into coexistence. In their last months in Japan, as demobilization orders arrived, many soldiers found themselves uneasy. They had come expecting enemies, found survivors, and were leaving uncertain of what victory meant. The taste of Japanese food lingered on their tongues, a mixture of smoke, salt, and something intangible, humility, perhaps, or grief, disguised as sweetness. When they boarded the ships home, the smell of the harbors clung to them. Some carried souvenirs, chopsticks, porcelain bowls, packets of tea. Others carried only memory. In the mess halls of transport vessels, they spoke quietly of noodles, of rice, of grilled chicken on skewers. It sounded absurd. Soldiers discussing seasoning in the shadow of atomic aftermath, yet it was their way of making sense of what they had witnessed. The war had given them no language for tenderness, so they found it in taste. Back in America, years later, many of them remembered Japan not through politics or geography, but through food. Veterans returning to small towns in Kansas, Ohio, California would smell soy sauce in a restaurant and pause. Some tried to recreate the dishes they had eaten, fumbling through improvised recipes with canned fish and vinegar. Others avoided it entirely, finding the flavor too haunting. Yet, whether sought or suppressed, the taste remained, a ghost of a nation they had once conquered and then, unknowingly, learned from. Meanwhile, in Japan, the street vendors carried on. Their carts multiplied as the economy revived. Children who had once begged for candy now sold skewers to American tourists. The food evolved, as did the people who made it. What had once been necessity became craft, then pride. And beneath that transformation lay the memory of those first awkward exchanges. A boy handing a skewer to a soldier, a woman bowing over a makeshift stove, smoke rising like a prayer between them. In the decades that followed, as Japan rebuilt itself into an industrial power, those early encounters faded from official history. Textbooks spoke of treaties and reconstruction, not of the small acts that sustained life in the ruins. Yet, in the undercurrent of daily life, in the sizzle of a street grill, in the steam rising from ramen stalls, traces of that past persisted. Food remembered what nations forgot. A few photographs survived, grainy, monochrome, fragile. In one, 2 American soldiers sit beside a vendor's cart, their helmets off, their faces turned toward the smoke. In another, a Japanese child stands between them, holding a skewer, smiling. There are no captions. The images exist outside ideology, suspended between hunger and grace. They are not scenes of triumph, nor repentance, but of continuity. The moment when war gave way, briefly, to appetite. Scholars decades later would study these interactions, calling them culinary diplomacy, soft cultural integration, post-conflict exchange. But such terms miss the essence. The truth was simpler. People ate together because they needed to remember they were alive. Amid the wreckage of nations, taste became testimony, proof that the human spirit, however battered, still sought connection. The soldiers who once marched through fire discovered, through a bowl of soup or a piece of grilled fish, that the world they had burned could still feed them, and the Japanese who had lost everything found, in feeding their conquerors, a strange form of defiance, not surrender, but survival. By the time the last American transport left Yokohama, the streets were already lined with food stalls again. Smoke rose where once there had been ash. The city's wounds were still open, but they smelled of salt and soy instead of death. The soldiers waved from the decks, some tossed cigarettes or chocolate bars toward the crowds on the pier. The people waved back, faces unreadable. Between them hung the faint aroma of street food, the scent of the living. Years later, when documentaries were made about the occupation, narrators spoke of policy, rebuilding, democracy. But the truer chronicle was written not in archives, but in kitchens, on street corners, in the shared act of eating. The taste of that moment, half sorrow, half grace, lingered far longer than the speeches or the treaties. It lived in the memory of flavor, in the quiet history of hands passing food across the boundaries of war. And so the story ends, not with victory parades or political signatures, but with the faint sound of oil crackling in a pan, with the smell of grilled chicken drifting through ruined streets, with men who had once been enemies standing together in the fragile warmth of shared hunger. The taste was ordinary, but the moment was not. It was the first taste of peace, smoky, sweet, uncertain, unforgettable.